Okay, so basically the final exam covers from Columbus and the Columbian Exchange, more specifically the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange would be like the exchange of all of the stuff that came from Europe to the Americas to the New World, and from the New World to Europe. So for example, like they had, so here are the Americas.
Is that like that chart?
Yep, that's that chart, exactly. Here's Florida. This is Central America, here would be South America down here. And then Europe would be over here. So they had gold. Gold went this way. They had diseases that they had never been exposed to, new diseases like smallpox and things like that. Horses. They had horses here. They had never had horses here before. And so like that's the exchange of all of those stuff. That table that we went over. And that would be the first thing that you could see on the final exam. And then what it goes to is it's going to go all the way through to the period after the Civil War. So it's going to go from Columbus up through the Civil War and what we call Reconstruction, which we're going to cover next week. We're not going to do a ton with Reconstruction, but we're going to cover that when we get back. So that's all of it. This would be, it seems like a lot of years, but we skipped a lot of years along the way. So this would be 1492 all the way to 1877. Okay? And that's what the final exam will cover. Now, as far as how much is covered on each of the topics, there's some topics that will be covered more, and other topics that won't be covered less. There'll be very little about, for example, Reconstruction. There'll be very little. We didn't do hardly anything with the presidents like James Monroe or Madison or John Quincy Adams. So there's like periods where, and I'll talk more about this next week, but periods that you don't need to know as much stuff. But what I'd like to cover is something that's like a core of what we did in class, like a huge chunk of what we did in class. So if in this whole time period, I think, did you notice I wrote down 1877? 1877.
You said the presidents have like three, like you just listed three of them won't be mentioned as much. Are we going to know like that worksheet and it was like all the
presidents and like events that they were known for? I'll go over more of that next week. I would rather do that with everyone because I know what sheet you're talking about. I want to get it out in front of you to look at it. Some of the stuff you might need to know, but probably not everything from there. I think if I'm going to go back and start studying and make all of this, like, make sense of all of this in my head, how I would go about doing it is I would divide it into two. So I would make a dividing line. Of all the history we've covered, I want to study in two different time periods, before this line and after this line. And this line that we're talking about is going to be 1789. This line is the year that George Washington becomes president. And so George Washington becomes president in 1789. Everything that happens afterwards is going to be the more recent stuff. Things that we've covered in quarter 2. Everything that happens before this line would be quarter 1 stuff. And this would include, so if we're talking about quarter 1 stuff, this would include the Columbian Exchange. This would include European colonization. And when I say European colonization, I mean like where did France set up colonies? So that would be like more in like Canada, and they were like fur trapping. Where did Spain set up colonies? That would be like more like Mexico and the Caribbean islands in South America.
Did we get a packet about this?
Yeah, we did. There was a packet about this. And we drew a map and we kind of like color coded it. Where did the English set up colonies? Well, that's what today is going to be the United States. And then what we're going to, the next thing would be what we call British colonial America. British colonial America. This includes like Jamestown, Plymouth, the 13 original colonies. This would include, remember when we did the packet about different regions, like what things are grown in different places? We did what people lived in different places. So this would be British colonial America. This starts, by the way, in 1607. That's Jamestown. And this will go until British colonial America will cover from 1607 to 1775. Actually, we'll say 1776. Do you know what date 1776 is famous for? It's okay if you don't. It's the Declaration of Independence. This is when we break away from Great Britain. As we go from 1607 to 1776, things that we would cover would be like the lead up to the Revolutionary War. That would include stuff like the Proclamation of 1763, stuff like the Stamp Tax. Do you remember the Stamp Act and the Stamp Tax? It would cover like the Sons of Liberty. It would cover, and you don't need to write down all of these terms per se because I'm going to give you a review sheet with all these terms on them, so you will have them. What I really want you to do while you're sitting here is do you try and remember and jog your memory back to some of this stuff. And if you don't, if some of this stuff sounds unfamiliar, ask. So the Stamp Tax, which was the first direct tax on the colonies. The Boston Tea Party, remember we talked about that?
Was there more than one Stamp Act?
There was just one Stamp Act, but there was more than one tax. There's a bunch of different taxes that are going to be there. So there's like a stamp tax, and there's a tax on tea, the tea tax, and which led to the Boston Tea Party. And there was a tax on glass and a tax, but you don't need to know all the taxes. There's just a couple that are important. And so this is like basically talking about, especially from 1750 to 1776 is going to be the lead up of the American Revolution. 1783 is the end of the Revolutionary War. End of the Revolutionary War. This happens in 1783. Following the end of the Revolutionary War is when... Oh, we got to squeeze one more thing in here. Can I squeeze one more thing in here? 1777 is when the Articles of Confederation were written. That was our first Constitution. Articles of Confederation. We'll go over more of this old stuff in class next week. I'm going to do the old stuff with everyone.
Did we make a timeline of this?
We did do a timeline of this. Yep, absolutely. And so what you could do honestly, and what I'll probably post this on YouTube. So anyone that wants to watch it, you could start pulling together some of this stuff if you have it from either old homework packets or your old notes, and you could get that ready for next week. That way when we go over it, you're like, got it all right here, and you can get it out, we can talk about it. And so the Articles of Confederation, which is our first try at a constitution, it sucks and fails. The end of the Revolutionary War is 1783, and then another big one is the Constitutional Convention, when we decide to scrap the Articles of Confederation. We have a Constitutional Convention to rewrite a new constitution, and this happens in 1787. The Constitutional Convention, 1787. And then just 2 years later is when the Constitution is ratified and George Washington's elected president. So this is all old stuff. This is more, I want to talk about new stuff though. The new stuff is the thing that I think some people had more trouble with. This stuff, since it is older, there's probably going to be, you're less likely to see a full-blown essay or something on the older stuff than you would be on the newer stuff, right? I gave you guys, if you remember the first few tests that we had a couple short answers and we had some diagrams and charts. You're likely to see diagrams and charts and things like that from this old stuff, just like on the old
stuff
stuff.
was like easier to comprehend.
Yeah, so I would say we did less in depth with the old stuff, and we've gone more in depth with the new stuff, which makes it harder to comprehend. Absolutely. All right, so quarter 2 is going to be picking up with the start of our current Constitution. Our current Constitution was written in 1787. It was ratified, and George Washington takes over in 1789. And so that's where we're placing ourselves. We're placing ourselves. I'm gonna talk to you today about what the heck happens when we start our country, right after the Revolutionary War. We're now an independent country. We now have a constitution that we've drafted up, and George Washington is elected president.
So was it ratified before he became president?
Yep, because in order for it to take effect, you have to have it be accepted or approved. Let me give you an example, like a sporting event, right? You couldn't play a basketball game until you had agreed upon the rules you were playing. Like, I can't coach a basketball game until I have a rule book that tells me what the rules are going to be so I can get ready to play.
So was George Washington like the deciding factor, like accepted it, or?
So that's a good question. So George Washington himself absolutely did not have the ability to just accept it himself. So all of the states, well, technically 9 of the 13 states had to approve it. All 13 states wound up approving it. So each of the states had to approve the Constitution before it took effect. Think about it, if I'm using my sports analogy, right? If George Washington is the coach of a team, one coach of one team can't just say, okay, I like these rules, we're going to play by these rules. All of the coaches of every team have to agree to it, right? And so that's the difference. And so here's the deal. I'm going to erase this part real quick. And this is the part where I think I lost some people and where it got kind of confusing. So we've done a ton of stuff. Do you remember how we've done a bunch of stuff with the 3 levels of government?
Yeah.
The national level, the state level, and the local level. Does this ring a bell? And we said at each level there are 3 branches of government. 3 branches here, and 3 branches here of government. At the national level, actually at every level, it's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Follow so far? At this level, we call this the president. And you should go over your whole chart. You have this in your notes. The legislative is called Congress.
Isn't it the Senate and then the
House? Yep, the House of Representatives, exactly. And this is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court. And then again, at the state level, this is called the governor. Governor. This is called the state Congress, which is made up of the state House of Representatives and the state Senate, state House of Reps, and then the state Supreme Court. Right? And then the local level, we said this is called the mayor. This is called the city council. And this is called the local district courts. Now, the reason I went over this again is for a couple of reasons. The first reason I went over this is the Articles of Confederation were our first attempt at a constitution for our country. These were written during the Revolutionary War. We're fighting a war against Great Britain. Americans are scrambling to win a war. They slap together a constitution, but it's not well done. This constitution, the Articles of Confederation, gives almost all the power to the state level governments, right? So the 13 colonies at the time would be considered the 13 states.
Does this
So
go back to like who's got the
who's got the power? right? And so, remember this chart that we did?
Yeah.
And it was who's got the power. This is up here, the national level has 100% of the power, and then the state and local has 0%. And down here, the national level would have 0% of the power, 0% of the power, and the state and local would have 100%. And we said the Articles of Confederation created a framework, a rule book in which the state and local level had almost all the power, right? And so what happens is after the Revolutionary War ends, it quickly becomes obvious that this is not okay. Like, we need a national level government that that can bring about some order. Let me put it this way. So, like, in your household, right, if something needs to be done, who has the final say, you or your parents? Right? Your parents have the final say. And that's just like, no, right? You're the kid. You have to live under their rules. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
A sister.
Okay, so, like, say you had, like, 5 sisters. Imagine, like, you and your sister in your relationship. If you and your 5 sisters lived together in your house, no parental supervision, none at all, and it was up to you to make the rules and cleaning schedules and who was cooking dinner and how you would get everyone to school, do you see that it would be more chaotic?
Yeah.
Like, if you and your 5 sisters had to figure out a cleaning schedule, probably nothing would ever get cleaned. Like, if it was up to you and your 5 sisters to decide when you were going to drive yourselves to school, you probably would be less likely to get to school. And the same was true, just in a different way, under the Articles of Confederation. It was 13 states, all had equal say, all had equal rights in the government, and there was no higher power to say, no, this is what we're going to do, this is collectively what we're doing as a household or a country, this is the direction we're going. There was a lot of fighting between states. States did not want to work together. They wouldn't trade with each other. They were making alliances with other countries. They were just looking out for their own best interest. Pretty much what would happen if you and you had 13 siblings that were trying to run a household. And so what wound up happening is they realized we need to give more power to the national government so it can act as, in a way, a parent to the state level governments and make sure that we are taking our country in one direction, right? Like, in some ways, you might not like living with your parents, but you kind of need to live with them for your own well-being. Like, your life, you might think it sounds better to, like, be able to do whatever you want, but if you think about it, your parents provide a lot of stuff for you that you need, right? So, the Constitutional Convention was the attempt to rewrite the Articles of Confederation. So here's the Articles of Confederation. We're getting rid of them. And we know that when the national level government has all of the power, this would be like living under the strictest parents you could ever imagine, and you have absolutely no say in anything. Think about, like, I don't know, what's a movie in which parents are overruling? Like, I guess Cinderella or something like that, right? This was kind of like what we lived under when we were living under the king, right? The king had all of the power. We had no say to do anything or make decisions for ourselves. And so, somewhere in the middle sounds best, right? And so the Constitutional Convention is going to be a debate about where we want to go. Do we want to give a lot more power to the national level government? Maybe just a little bit more power? Where do you want to end up? And so the whole Constitutional Convention, our founding fathers try and write a constitution that is somewhere nicely in the middle. And so we wind up with something probably somewhere around here, which is our current constitution today. Hello.
I thought I would be the only one stupid enough to come in.
No, review session. How you doing, man?
I'm good, how are you?
Doing well.
Happy New Year, Merry Christmas.
Happy New Year. How was your Christmas?
It's alright.
Yeah?
2 little kids, how could it be bad?
Yeah, I bet they were loving it, huh?
They did. Alright, I won't keep you. It's fun to say hello.
I'm glad you did. I'll see you in a couple days. And so our Constitution is this kind of happy medium in which we've divided power between the national, state, and local.
So do they all have equal power?
No, they don't have. That's a good question. So does each have equal? No. Today, the way it's worked out, and the beauty of and this is where it gets confusing. So tell me if you get confused here. The beauty of our Constitution is it's a very vague rule book. So it doesn't. It's not so specific that it just plops it at one point on the spectrum. it leaves questions unanswered. Like, I don't know what the Constitution says. And so they wanted the Supreme Court to be the ones that kind of interpret the law. So it's moved. Early on, right after the Constitution was written, it was probably down here, right? Where the states still had a lot of the power, and the national government had more power. So as we go this way, the national government gets more power. Do you understand that? And as we go this way, the state governments get more power. So early on, the Constitution the national government probably had a little bit less power than the state governments. But as we've moved over time, we've jumped spots, and we're probably somewhere up around here today, in which the national government has its hand and has more power than the state and local governments. But it can change. That's the crazy part. Like, theoretically, if the people in the United States got really ticked off and thought that President Obama was, some harsh dictator, theoretically they could, you could amend the Constitution and you could go in a direction in which the state level governments took more of the power back.
Where was the power when it was just like the colonies?
Good question. So when it was just the colonies, it was like up here. This is colonial America. And the reason I would say that is because the king had all the decision-making power. The king wanted to tax them more, they taxed them more. And the colonists had no say in it. The king wanted to station troops there, he put troops there. They had no say in it. The king wanted to, anything the king wanted to do, he could. And the state and local governments, or the colonial governments, couldn't do much about it at all. Right? And so after the Revolutionary War, we didn't like this. And we fought a Revolutionary War to fight and gain our freedom. So logically, after you go from a situation where you have this, we did the opposite. Like, no, we're going to give all the power to the state and local governments and not much power to the national government, because they just fought a Revolutionary War in which the national government or the king had all the power and they hated it. But this didn't work enough. This was like the situation with if you were living in your house with, 5 sisters and trying to make decisions for yourself. This didn't work out well either. So they knew they needed somewhere in the middle. And they didn't know exactly where in the middle was best. There was a big debate. Should you be more up here? Should you be more down here? And so what they did is they made a very vague constitution that allowed for movement. We can move. And that's kind of the hard part. What did you do your federalism project on? Do you remember? Do you know that project? You know what I'm talking about way back when? Like some kids did it on gay marriage, some kids did it on a lot of people did it on abortion, a lot of people did it on their federalism project on there's lots. But anyways, depending on the issue depends on who gets the final say. Sometimes national gets the final say, sometimes the state governments get the final say. So for example, here's an example. The state of Michigan last year basically said that the wolves in Michigan were no longer an endangered species. And they said wolves have populated quite a bit in the Upper Peninsula, and so we're going to allow people to hunt wolves this year. We're going to say that 10 wolves can be killed because they're eating livestock. And so people in Michigan weren't real happy about this. Some were supportive of it. If you owned, like a farm and your farm animals were getting eaten by wolves, you're like, yeah, kill them all. But if you love animals, wolf lovers were like, no, you can't kill wolves. And it was our state saying, no, we can do what we want with the animals in our state. And then just this year, the national government put wolves back on the endangered species list. And so now guess what? The state of Michigan can't hunt wolves anymore because the national level government said, no. These gray wolves are going to go back onto the endangered species list. So they stepped in and said, we're going to have more power over you states. Other issues, the national government have let the states.
Couldn't the national government just overrule them whenever they wanted?
They can. But if they do that too much, if the national government overrules the state governments too much, and a state gets ticked off enough, maybe a state tries to leave the United States of America. That's what happened during the Civil War. National government said, nope, you know what, we're not going to allow slavery. Essentially, it's a little more complicated than that. But the national government, and when Abraham Lincoln got elected, the southern states felt that slavery was in jeopardy, that they were going to...
That point come up in our seminar, if the state tried to leave
Yeah, should a state be able to leave? You know, when is it okay for a state to leave the country? And so the Civil War, you had 11 states that left our country because they were so ticked off at the national government trying to tell them what to do. During the Civil War, the southern states would have argued that this dot had gotten too close to up here again. And essentially, the southern states felt like they were doing the same thing our colonies were doing to Great Britain. They just wanted to break free and become independent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's exactly, it's a great question. So like, at what point can a state break away from the national government? And the Constitution doesn't say anything about it, it's vague on it. And so that becomes a big question. So,
Hold on. Since the national government can overrule them, can the state government overrule the local government?
yeah, so state governments can overrule local governments. So, check this out. Local government, like city level government, the city of Detroit's government, a couple of years back, and for several years before that, had been mismanaging its money like crazy. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of dirty things going on in Detroit politics. Just last year, the state said, Detroit, you have mismanaged your money so much, you are now in bankruptcy, you are like literally broke. The state appointed their own person to run the city of Detroit. It was an emergency manager. And the state said, you must abide by this emergency manager's decision. They suspended the mayor's role, they suspended the city council's role, and they put in an emergency financial manager. Must. His name was Kevin Orr. And it was because they said, Detroit, you've mismanaged your local government so bad, the state has to come in and help out.
Did the local district courts, did something happen to them too? Or did they
So they still stayed in place. But the legislative and executive branches were essentially just like dissolved. They were just like completely suspended for the time being. And just, I'm literally talking like a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, the manager, and they restored the power of the mayor, Mike Duggan, and the city council. So they are just now able to start running their city again, and power was given back to them. Now, if the state refused to restore the mayor and the city council's power back, they could appeal to the national level government and say, hey, we're totally getting stepped on here by the state, and then maybe the national government could have stepped in and said, no, state level government, you got to let them get back on their feet. I don't think it would have happened, but technically that. Ultimately, our Constitution says that they have the most power unless it's specifically written that the state, there are certain issues that the state has the final say on. But there are more issues that the national government has the final say than state issues. One state level issue that they have the final say is gay marriage. States can either decide to allow gay marriages or not allow. Michigan does not allow gay marriages.
That will change.
It can change. It almost did change. The national government has just decided to allow states to make their own decision on this. Another one would be issues surrounding medical marijuana and the legalization of marijuana. The national government has allowed state governments to decide. In Michigan, medical marijuana is okay. For certain conditions, if you have glaucoma or other conditions, the state says it's okay, we'll allow this to happen. The state of Washington or the state of Oregon, for example, or Colorado, they've said anyone over the age of 18 that wants to smoke small amounts of marijuana are allowed to. The national government, they might not like it, but they allow the state to make the decision itself. Does that make sense? Okay. And so, the very first thing, I'm jumping now. The very first thing that we talked about in quarter 2, right, after 1789, was we did the structure of government. So I just explained that to you. So this is the structure of government. Which included the structure of government, which includes the 3 levels of government, the national, state, and local, 3 levels, and then also the different branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. And then the next thing we did was the whole where's the power, which I just went through with you. Where's the power? Where should the power rest? Should the national level government have more say? Should the state level governments have more say? Or should local governments have more say? What issues do they have power in? And then we talked about, so if we're going back to our chart, can I redraw this chart real quick? It's not really a chart, it's more just like a graphic. Do you follow so far, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. 0, national, equals 100, state, local. Okay. So, because our Constitution is vague, it's more like a range, right? Here's our current Constitution. And where that dot falls, where we actually fall in here, changes. And this causes debate. It still goes on today. Like, for example, Republicans and Democrats, our political parties, they have very different ideas of where the dot should fall. Republicans would want the dot falling closer to here. Democrats would want the dot falling closer to here. Right? They're different. Democrats tend to be more for more national level government involvement. Republicans tend to say, no, government, stay out. Don't tax us as much. Don't regulate things as much. Let the state companies and businesses do their own thing. And so this debate about where the dot should fall was the very next thing we covered, which is the formation of political parties. So this is the formation of political parties. And the first political parties were the Federalists.
Oh, was this with those two guys?
Mhm.
One has the
Yep.
big...
Yep. And the Democratic Republicans. Is it starting to come back now? The Democratic Republicans. And so the Federalists, they wanted a more powerful federal government. They wanted by the way, this national level government, we can also say the federal government, the federal level government.
Okay, I never understood the name Democratic Republicans. Because isn't that heavy?
Both of the things in there. So so your question is you never really understood the name Democratic Republicans. It's very confusing. Do not think about today's political parties. If you try and think about today's political parties and the fact that we have Democrats and Republicans, how could we have a fused? They just chose these words because this sounded like Democratic. It sounded like they were allowing people to have a say, and Republican has to do with the form of government. It's just a name. It's just a name. So I can't think of an example. But don't try and figure out how we get our political parties today from these
So
two.
it doesn't really have anything to do like...
Nothing. It has nothing to do with our political parties today. Absolutely nothing. That's the best way to put it. And so the Democratic Republicans, they wanted less federal government involvement. They wanted less power to the national level government. Do you follow so far? And there's a PowerPoint which is on, I think it's on Plus Points. I'll have to check and make sure. But that talks about, don't worry about looking at it right now. That talks about how these political parties formed, who helped found them, why they formed. And this all happens during George Washington's presidency. So we said George Washington's president in 1789, and this happens during his presidency. The person that is associated with the Federalist Party, he's considered the father of the Federalist Party, is a guy named Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. Just coming back to you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the person associated with the Democratic Republicans is, starts with a J. It's Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. And these two guys, Hamilton...
Did Hamilton want the bigger...
Government. Yeah, Hamilton wants a huge freaking government, remember? So Hamilton was a Federalist. He wanted more power for the national government. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. He wanted less power to the national government. Because remember, the higher up you are on the spectrum, the more power the national government would be. So if this is national has 100% of the power, state and local have 0. If this would be 50-50 here, like they split the power completely evenly, this would be like 75-25. This would be like national has 25% of the power, state and local have 100, or state and local have 75% of the
How
power.
come these guys' opinions matter if Washington's president and he just
It's a good question. So why do these two guys' opinions matter if Washington's the guy running the show? So here's the thing. These two were part of Washington's cabinet. They were his cabinet members. Washington's cabinet. They were his most trusted advisors. These are the people helping him make decisions. Washington doesn't want to be a guy that just makes decisions himself. He does not want to appear like he's a king, right? He doesn't want to just be giving orders, and so he consults people a lot. And two of the guys that he consults the most are Hamilton and Jefferson. And when Washington comes to them and says, well, do you think the federal government should have the final say, or do you think we should give this one to the state and local governments? Hamilton usually says, national government should decide this. It's best if the national government decides it has the final say or more power on this issue. And Jefferson wound up being the type of guy that sided more with state and local governments. Like, no, we should have less power on, the federal government doesn't need to be involved in taxing whiskey. Like, why would we do that? Give that power to the state and local governments. And so they continued to differ. Washington would go to Jefferson, and he'd have one opinion. And then he'd go to Hamilton, and he'd say, no, the federal government should have more power. Does that make sense? And the other thing you have to keep in mind, though, is that even if the president wants something to happen, he doesn't have the full power to make something a law. In order for a law to be created, Congress has to pass the law. The president cannot pass a law. The president himself cannot pass a law. The Senate and the House of Representatives both have to agree for a law to pass. They pass laws, Congress does. The president signs them into law. But, so, as Hamilton and Jefferson, as these guys wrote their opinions, right? As they started writing their opinions that they would consult with Washington, they'd write this out, they convinced members in Congress to also either agree or disagree with them. So what you start having is in Congress, you have Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Those who support Hamilton or those who support Jefferson. And so it's not just like two guys, it becomes a group of people. And that's why it becomes a political party, is because people in general either tend to side with Hamilton or side with Jefferson. And so that's how the first political parties were formed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you follow so far?
Yeah. So like, if you were to put them, like Washington and those two guys into the chart, so
Yeah.
like, Washington would be like the executive part of it. Wouldn't it?
Yep.
And then,
Yeah, so if we're filling out the framework, this is a great question. So if we're filling it out, here's the Senate and House of Representatives. Washington is the president. So if I'm filling this out, it's Washington. Now, the executive branch is made up of the president plus the cabinet.
So then,
And this is where Hamilton and Jefferson would be. That's a great question. That's a great question. So the executive branch is made up of the president and his cabinet, and Hamilton and Jefferson were two of his most trusted cabinet members. Okay, now, I'm going to just do a couple more things, and I think that this is a really good start for one little review session. Once we talked about the formation of political parties, right? We did a lot with this, and we talked a lot about, this is where we did our federalism project, this is where we did all these charts that I made you guys memorize, like this and what this means. Then we skipped ahead. So then we just did the worksheet with the presidents from Washington, Washington, all the way through to the president of John Quincy Adams. And we just did the one worksheet. It was, there were several major events. I said, make sure you're familiar with which events correspond to which president. And so, like Thomas Jefferson, one of the big events was the Louisiana Purchase, the fact that we bought tons of new land and expanded the country. And then we picked up with our next major one that we spent a lot of time with, which was Andrew Jackson's presidency. Do you remember doing that packet, the Andrew Jackson, with primary sources? We talked about how Andrew Jackson, some of the policies he had. I'll show you guys in class. Andrew Jackson's presidency. We did a bunch of charts on how more people were voting. We did quite a bit with Jackson's presidency. And after Andrew Jackson's presidency, then we jumped into westward expansion. Do you remember doing the political cartoon on Manifest Destiny? The lady carrying the book who's floating. It was like a political cartoon. They were moving westward and that kind of thing. Westward expansion. This is Manifest Destiny. And then we did the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War.
Did we cover a lot of material on that, or not so much?
The Mexican-American War? Not a ton, but the big part was what territory we gained. So we talked a lot about, we didn't talk about who fought,
Was this more on that worksheet you gave us, that study guide kind of?
Yeah. You drew United States and filled in what territory we got and talked about, that's all part of that. And then from here we did the lead up to the Civil War. And we talked about slavery, we talked about popular sovereignty, the ability for people to decide whether or not a territory is going to have slavery itself. We talked about what happened in Kansas and things like that, and then we did all those primary documents about Lincoln's election and the lead up to the Civil War. The one other thing I'll say is we spent a lot of time, and I should I'll make mention of this in class, but we did spend a lot of time with the lead up to the American Revolution. So the Declaration of Independence was 1776, and the Articles of Confederation were 1777. We did do quite a bit from 1763 to 1775, which is the lead up to the American Revolution, or the Revolutionary War. And we'll talk more about that. But if you can go back, what I would have you do is if you can go back and take a look at your notes from things that you have worksheets and notes-wise, from the structure of government, the formation of political parties, the Washington and the President's packets, and the stuff we did on Andrew Jackson and the westward expansion and that kind of stuff, if you can understand the formation of political parties, the where's the power, and the structure of government, that's a core central thing. It's something that you're going to see quite a bit of on the final exam. It's something that you might have to write some type of short answer or essay on, about understanding the difference between why we have this debate today. How much power should the federal government have? Should it be really powerful or not powerful? And that's the reason I think it's so important, is because when you look at the news, right? When you see the news and you see something about Detroit going into bankruptcy and the state government appointing an emergency financial manager, I want you to be able to say, oh, this is like this whole federalism debate playing out. Should the national government have more power? Should the state government have more power? Or should local governments have more power? When you turn on, or your parents are talking about, elections, they're talking about Republicans and Democrats. They fit into this spectrum, right? So today, like, the Republicans tend to be more down here and the Democrats tend to be more up here. And so if you understand that stuff, you can kind of understand things going on today in our actual real world as opposed to like way back when in history. So I will cover more of this stuff in class next week because this is the oldest stuff and people are going to be least familiar with it. But if I were you, I would go back through and do this stuff first. Structure of government, where's the power, formation of political parties.
It's more like the westward and the Mexican War. I don't remember as much.
Okay, we'll cover more of that too in class this week. I can do that, no problem. So I need to do more with Jackson. I'll review with this. We'll review this in class. And we'll do a day of review with this stuff in class. We'll block off 2 days to review. And we get 1 day the following week too, which will be a review day. The one last thing I'll say, and this will be it before I head down, is this structure, right, is how it is today. This structure of our national level government is what our Constitution sets up. Like this, what our Constitution, if you read through it, which is, I have a copy of it over here somewhere.
So the Constitution's like based on the national level.
It sets up the national level government. The Constitution is the rule book for the national level government. But what the Constitution doesn't, the powers that the Constitution doesn't give to the national level government then either fall to the state or local. This is the rule book for the national level government. So, like, let me give you a quick example. Professional sports, right? I'm just going to use basketball because I coach basketball. You don't have to know that much about basketball to understand this. But the NBA has its own rule book, does it not?
No.
College has its own rule book. College basketball and pro basketball are not exactly the same. For example, pro basketball plays 4 quarters. College plays 2 halves. But the game itself is very similar, right? They're still the same fouls, they're the same things, but it's a little bit different. The national level government has its own constitution. It's the rule book. State level governments, they don't have to completely abide by every rule in this constitution. They can't completely violate it 100%, but they're allowed to have some differences. We have our own state constitution. It's mirrored or similar to the federal constitution, but it's different. The city of Detroit has its own, rule book that it plays off of. And so there's differences between the three. The Constitution of the United States is what sets up the rules for the national level government. That's why we have a president, Congress, or an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. The president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. The other level of governments, they've just copied the same framework as the national level government because it works, and you just copy what the more powerful, stronger one above you does. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. I think we'll stop there. So here's what I do. I'm gonna